Washington Journal continues.
Our guest now is Adam Andrzejewski, and he's going to help us, as we do often on this program, take a look into COVID spending, COVID policy, all things related to the pandemic. And what our guest is going to do now is talk to us about some of the numbers. And Adam Andrzejewski is founder and CEO of OpenTheBooks.com. Good morning. Tell us what OpenTheBooks.com does.
Hi, Paul. Great to join you today. So at OpenTheBooks.com, our mission is quite simply summarized as every dime online in real time. So last year, our auditors, we filed 40,000 Freedom of Information Act requests on nearly every single substantial public body in this entire country. And we successfully captured $6 trillion worth of federal, state, and local spending. We display it all on our website at openthebooks.com. So regular people where you live can hold your elected officials accountable for tax and spend decisions. We also get into public policy. So we've got a petition that fits very well with this segment. It's a petition at the federal level. You could just hit the petition tab. It's called Read the Bill. We've seen these omnibus, massive spending bills, aid bills, and our legislators just don't have time to read the bills. So I ask you, Paul, do we have a representative republic if our representatives don't have time to read these massive bills? We think they need a 72-hour timeout to read it. We've got a petition on that basis.
Let's read into some of the numbers on this $1.9 trillion COVID bill, the one that passed the Senate over the weekend, should get passage in the House tomorrow from what we hear. Let's break some of this down, Mr. Andrzejewski. Individual payments, $437 billion as part of this one single bill. Money to state and local governments, something they have been asking for, $350 billion. Unemployment benefits, $230 billion. K-12 and higher education, $168 billion, and some more money for the Paycheck Protection Program, $7 billion. What do you see in these numbers, sir?
Well, these are big numbers. I think 10 days ago, the Wall Street Journal crunched the numbers, and they said if you're very generous, if you count the dollars that is related to actually funding directly the coronavirus pandemic, it's about $800 to $900 million, a little less than $1 trillion. On $1.9 trillion, that leaves an extra $1 trillion that's not related to direct payments. Our position has been, if you need more testing, if you need more dollars for vaccinations and the vaccine, if you need more payments to small businesses which are hurting and individuals with are hurting, deliver a bill on that basis, a targeted, quote unquote, skinny bill, a bill that directs government money, our tax dollars, to people who have real needs. Let some of these other things that are being funded to the tune of $1 trillion, save those for another day.
Our guest will take your calls in a couple of minutes. We'll keep the phone lines on the bottom of the screen. We're reviewing the COVID bill that is about to get passed in the House and all COVID spending in general. So we'll leave those phone numbers. We'll get to your calls in a moment. But for Mr. Andrzejewski, Chris Murphy, the senator from Connecticut, on Thursday took issue with criticism that non-COVID priorities are in this American Rescue Plan. Here's what he had to say.
Well, let's just take a look at what was broadly part of the CARES Act that was supported by every single Republican, and what is broadly part of the American Rescue Plan. Because my Republican colleagues thought that everything in the CARES Act was COVID relief, whether it was designed to immediately attack the healthcare crisis or whether it was designed to address the economic crisis. There were stimulus checks in the CARES Act. Not as big as the ones in the American Rescue Plan, but they were COVID relief when we passed the CARES Act. Now, according to Republicans, they're not COVID relief. There was an unemployment extension and a plus-up in the maximum benefit under the CARES Act. That was COVID relief back in March of last year, but now, according to Republicans, it's not COVID relief. There was money for vaccines and for testing in the CARES Act. In the American Rescue Plan, money for vaccines, testing. Small business relief was, of course, conceived in the CARES Act, the PPP program. That's a big part of the American Rescue Plan, but now it's not COVID relief, according to my Republican colleagues, whereas it was last year. There was state and local funding in the CARES Act. There's state and local funding in the American Rescue Plan. There was rent and mortgage relief in the CARES Act. There's rent and mortgage relief in the American Rescue Plan. All of a sudden, since Democrats took control of the White House and took control of the Senate, all of these things, which were categorized as COVID relief by Republicans in March, are no longer COVID relief. You're just supposed to think of these as extras, as Democratic priorities.
Mr. Andrzejewski, what do you make of those comments by Senator Murphy?
So at OpenTheBooks.com, we're a nonpartisan organization. So look, on the CARES Act, I'm a senior contributor at Forbes. I wrote a piece at Forbes with 500,000 views on all the waste in the CARES Act. And it was extreme. For instance, on the Paycheck Protection Program, it was rushed through Congress. Senator Coons is right. Everybody voted for it. Nobody had time to simply read the bill. So we found Paycheck Protection Program loans and grants flowing, for instance, to Hollywood. Kanye West, for his sneaker company, he got over $2 million. The sneaker company has a value, according to Kanye, of over $3 billion. You had Robert Redford's Sundance Institute. They're a non-for-profit organization. They got over $3 million worth of PPP money. You had the producer of The Godfather, Francis Ford Coppola, probably the best movie ever made in the history of the world. He's got two companies, Francis Ford Coppola Presents and a wine company. Collectively, they got $8.5 million. Look, when these bills are rushed, there's a lot of waste in those bills.
And what do you see specifically? Here is a Forbes piece that you did write about this new bill. Is there wasteful spending in this bill? Answer your own question. Point to a couple of things that you think just should not be there.
So there are billion-dollar pieces of waste in this latest bill, and there are $1 million. Let's just take one that's $1 million piece of waste. So we identified, our auditors, in the bill, a new perk for federal workers. So although there are cash payments for $1,400 to individuals across the country in this bill, if you're a federal worker and if your child's school isn't open, the new perk says that you can stay home and take care of your child, even if the school's hybrid, if they're not back full time, and you get the equivalent of $1,400 a week for 15 weeks, up to $21,000 paid to stay home. Now, we know the federal benefit and pay package. The average federal worker in 78 large agencies makes over $100,000 a year on cash compensation. You already get 12 weeks of unpaid time off for family leave. Furthermore, if you're on the job for just 3 years, you have 43 days of paid time off. That's holidays, sick days, and vacation days. So not quite, but almost every single week, if you're a federal bureaucrat, is a 4-day work week already.
Let's get to Bob, our first call. Hometown, Illinois, Republican caller. You're on with the founder and CEO of OpenTheBooks.com. His name is Adam Andrzejewski. Good morning.
Good morning, Adam. I enjoy your website. I've been on there several times. It's very informative, very entertaining.
Thank you.
One thing I heard at the beginning of this bill was money to count amberjack tuna in the Gulf of Mexico. Is that true? Are they spending money to count fish swimming in the Gulf of Mexico?
So look, our auditors, we haven't found that. So when the House dropped this bill, Nancy Pelosi, about 10 days ago, it was on a Friday night, it was 591 pages, and we read that entire bill. The Senate redid the bill. It's about 621 pages. And so, we're still going through that. Some of the changes in between the two bills, for instance, we found a new section. There's $75 million, again, $1 million piece of waste, going to the Center for Public Broadcasting. This is National Public Radio. This is Big Bird. I don't think taxpayers need to be subsidizing this. And furthermore, on their balance sheets as nonprofit organizations, they have hundreds of millions of dollars.
Marion is calling from Grovetown, Georgia. Democratic caller. Hey, Marion.
Hey, Thanks for taking my call.
You're welcome.
I have to smile at your guest, because it should be OpenTheRepublicanBook.com, because you just talk the talking points. You talk about Hollywood getting PPP. You don't talk about churches who do not get taxed. Many churches have gotten lots of money through the PPP. So let's not be so partisan. And another thing,
I want to cover that.
Marion, let me jump in and get a response first, and then we'll go back to you. Go ahead, Adam.
So that's a good perspective. We mapped every single PPP quote unquote loan. Many of those will turn into grants paid for by the American taxpayer, between $1 million and $10 million. There was many churches on that list. We segmented for national journalists, because our data, it's open for everybody, left, right, and center to write articles on. We segmented the data that went to churches because it was all coded in the database. We sliced that, we sent it to journalists, they wrote articles, they made national news on those dollars going to churches. And for everybody out there, if you believe that government money comes with strings and influence, then it is troubling that America's churches were on getting big payments out of that PPP fund. Now, I just want to say, we're a nonprofit at OpenTheBooks.com. We're a public charity. We could have qualified for $300,000 through that program, but we would never accept government money. We're watchdogs. That would harm our mission.
Remind us how you're funded then. How do you operate?
We're funded by people. We're funded by individuals and foundations. We accept no government funding.
Let me jump back to Marion. Marion, are you still there?
Okay, thank you. To me, and I'm very, very sorry, but it's blah, 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 what you talk about. You are funded by very wealthy people who have an agenda, and the $1.9 trillion, am I still on?
You are.
Oh, okay. The $1.9 trillion is, yes, it's for vaccines, but everything else, because of the COVID crisis in this country, the states and local counties and states need money because the revenue is down. So everything is related to COVID. It's a COVID relief. It is going to help us in all ways. The $3,000 for the children that are very, very poor, that's all because right now all of us are suffering. I don't think you get this. And it's really depressing to hear people like you talk like this. Thank you.
Mr. Andrzejewski, go ahead, please.
So I think, I acknowledged at the outset, there's real pain out there. This is a global pandemic. It has hurt America greatly. So we do need targeted relief. People that have real needs, those needs need to be funded. That's the role of government. America is rich enough to provide for a robust, soft social safety net. I think where there can be debate is when that soft social safety net turns into a hammock and impinges the future. In terms of local and state funding, we've done oversight on exactly where this bill on $350 billion would send the money. For example, you have California. The state government would get $26 billion. They're the largest on population of the 50 states. They get the most money. The second one is actually tribal governments. They would get $20 billion. So after California, exceeding the other 49 states are tribal governments. We looked up the population of Native Americans, and there's about 3 million. So on average, on a population basis, there's $6,700 per Native American flowing to tribal governments. And that far exceeds any other allocation. For instance, Puerto Rico has 3 million people. They're getting $4 billion out of the program.
Keith, Toledo, Ohio, independent caller. Good morning to you.
Good morning. Yes, we're spending so much money, it's like it's not real money. I think the people out in the country are wondering, what is our, how long is this going to go on? I think we're paying about $400 billion now in interest. I have a question. On our debt right now, it's about $30 trillion. or less. But can that $400 billion, if we don't incur no more interest, can that go up when things come due? I don't know that much about it, but we're basically that $400 billion. If that grows too big interest wise, we're not paying down the debt. We're never going to pay down the debt. We're just trying to maintain the interest. When will it come to a point or people see that we'll be spending more money on interest than we do on the military that people seem to complain about? That's the only thing that keeps this country going.
Let's hear from our guest.
So we have the same view on the national debt as Obama's chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mike Mullins, said back in 2011, 2012. And he said that long term, our national debt is our greatest national security threat. Our national rollout at OpenTheBooks.com was arm in arm with our former honorary chairman, Dr. Tom Coburn. And sadly, Coburn passed about a year ago. May he rest in peace. But Coburn wrote the book called The Debt Bomb. And he says this system works right up until the cliff moment when it doesn't. And that's how we see it. So let's walk through a brief history on the national debt. When Barack Obama took office, the national debt was about $10 trillion. When Donald Trump came into office, the national debt was nearly $20 trillion. After 4 years, when he leaves, it's $28 trillion. And if we pass this American Rescue Act at about $1.9 trillion, we're going to go north of $30 trillion. That's a stunning triple since the first year of the Obama administration.
There's that headline, U.S. debt set to double over the next 30 years. This is according to the Congressional Budget Office. Explain for us, Mr. Andrzejewski, what does a high or higher debt mean to the functioning of government here in Washington and to the country as a whole?
So first off, in relation to the economy, it's a huge part of the economy right now. We haven't seen the level of debt to the gross domestic product since World War II, and we haven't fought a world war. So the interest on the debt starts to crowd out government services because you have to spend, soon over the course of the next 3 or 4 years, the interest on the debt will exceed our budget for our military. Furthermore, when the government spends money, it crowds out private investment. So government investment is then prioritized over private investment, and there can be misallocation of resources. I want to give you some examples. So on this $350 billion bailout of states and localities, we took a look at your hometowns receiving dollars in this bill. And Beverly Hills is getting bailed out to the tune of $6.3 million. I don't think zip code 90210 needs a coronavirus bailout. You've got the Hamptons. The Hamptons are getting bailed out north of $8 million. You've got Key West down in Florida, $10.1 million of coronavirus bailout in this bill. You've got Greenwich in Connecticut. All the elites and wealthy, they fled New York City during the pandemic. They went to Greenwich, and they're getting $20 million out of this bill. You've got some of the wealthiest towns in the country, like Atherton, California. They're the #1 wealthiest place, according to Bloomberg. They've got an average household income north of $525,000 per family, and they're getting $1.4 million out of this bill. You can look up your hometown on our interactive map on our website. My hometown here in Hinsdale, Illinois, it's the 36th richest place in the country, according to Bloomberg. And we're getting $2.1 million of bailout out of this bill. We don't need it.
Half hour left with our guest. Conrad is calling from Philadelphia, Republican caller. Hey there.
Yeah, how you doing? I'd just like to ask the gentleman a question. He has the program OpenTheBooks.com. Well, has he ever looked in the books to see how much money that we send overseas to all them foreign countries? Maybe if they stop spending all our taxpayers' money overseas for 1 month, we can fund everything that goes on in the United States.
Conrad, what is your perspective on how much this country spends on foreign aid? Do you know?
Well, the perspective is, I see articles. I look at your TV broadcast. I hear CNN saying that money they send overseas, the money they send overseas to all the rich oil states, all the rich people that have, I bet you we send more money overseas than we take in from overseas. So let's stop sending our taxpayers' money overseas, and maybe nobody going to have a problem.
Thanks, Conrad, for calling. He makes the point about foreign aid.
So during the Trump administration, when he issued the order to take a look at removing the United States from the World Health Organization, we took a look at how much money over the course of the last 10 years funded the WHO. And it was a smaller amount of money than what people realize, I believe. It was but it was still substantial. Look, it's $3.5 billion, and that's only a small portion of our foreign aid.
Let's hear from David. David's in Denison, Texas, on the Republican line. Good morning, David.
Yes, good morning. And as far as that fellow's commentary on the foreign aid, I mean, the caller, boy, is he off. Our foreign aid is the tiniest possible fraction of what this bill is about. It's not even close. The thing that's bothering me is that the U.S. forever has gone through financial cycles and crashes. Now, the links between them has gotten longer than it used to be before the Federal Reserve was put together in 1913, I believe. But it was put together in 1913 because of the crash of 1907. It's a horrible crash. And we're living in a time now where most of the people on Wall Street, and certainly a lot of other folks, can't remember what the last bear market was like. If you go back to 2008, go back to 2000, we had some really bad downturns. And the average interest rate on our loans, the federal deficit, has averaged 5.5% going back to probably 1913, or I don't know when they started that calculation, but it's many years. We're living on borrowed time when it comes to the interest on the national debt. It's practically nothing now. So once we start to creep back up, at some point reality is going to sneak back in, because there is no free lunch. You can't just print money out of thin air, which is what they're doing on a massive scale internationally. It's not even just national; it's international as far as the printing money out of absolutely nowhere. It's not connected to anything. I don't know what they're thinking. The listening to them talk about the S&P the other day, they said that the forward PE is like 22.5 right now. Historically, in recent years, it's been 17.5. This isn't. At some point, it's got to go down.
Thanks for calling, David. Let's hear from our guest.
It's a good perspective. I'm glad you brought it up. Look, let's talk about the total toolbox of administrative, legislative, and Federal Reserve response to the coronavirus just over the course of the past year. Look, these amounts are stunning. They're so large, it's hard to get perspective on these amounts. We determined there's about a 10 to $11 trillion, even without this latest bill, a $10 to $11 trillion toolbox. Let's break it down. So administrative response, to an emergency coming out of the executive office of the president, about $750 billion. We've already talked about through Congress, about already allocated is $4.1 trillion. What's not talked about is the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve committed to $5.9 trillion. Now, the Federal Reserve in their toolbox, they disclose they've only used about $2.8 trillion of that money in response to the coronavirus. Congress, out of their $4.1 trillion, they've left $1 trillion on the table. It's unspent. It's still working through the system. It's hard to spend that type of money. But yet, in this bill, there's another $1.9 trillion that Congress is putting on the table. Our position is, look, after all of this spending, let the dollars work through the system. If there are people at the end of the day that have real needs, target a targeted bill to serve those people.
Mr. Andrzejewski, as we looked at the state, the recipients of aid to the states, California on top with $42 billion. The tribal governments, which we've talked about, Florida, $17 billion. Mitt Romney earlier in that clip mentioned Florida. Question, if a state is doing particularly okay or well right now, can they refuse this money?
Well, I hope so. And I think every state should analyze, every local government should analyze whether they really need the money. And if they don't, send it back, because all of this is borrowed. Look, this bill, there was a new allocation formula on the $350 billion sent to the states and localities. And rather than on population, it went to unemployment rate. So this was a feature that came out of Nancy Pelosi's House. So, for instance, in West Virginia, with Joe Manchin as the swing senator in the U.S. Senate, we were interested to see how he would vote on this bill, because West Virginia, on this new allocation, they lose $1.5 billion. Now, California and New York, they're the big winners in this bill. California, on the formula allocation change to unemployment, they reap an extra $6.7 billion. New York reaps a little over $6 billion. Florida, obviously, is the big loser. Governor Ron DeSantis kept the state open for business. Florida's flourishing. And so they lose over $2 billion in this bill.
More of the figures, before we get back to calls, just a little bit more perspective. Here are some figures for coronavirus response funding before this current bill, the one that's about to be passed by the House. Paycheck Protection Program, $796 billion is the figure for the PPP. This is since March of 2020, prior to this current bill. Individual payments, $730 billion. Unemployment, $630 billion. State and local, $340 billion. K through 12, $102 billion before this current bill. Talk to us about those larger figures and what they are going to mean in the future.
So let's talk about unemployment. Obviously, with 40 million people unemployed at the height of the pandemic, there was a lot of pain out there. There were real needs out there. So Congress did flood the system with unemployment benefits. And look, this was pushed down to the states. Nearly overnight, they had to fill all these claims. California has studied this, and there is a tsunami of fraud, of fraudsters, of con artists, of crime syndicates. California, just in that state alone, believes that basically 27% of all money that they sent out in terms of unemployment benefits was a ripoff, was a fraud. This is a fraud on a scale we've never seen in public agencies before. And it was due to the states having outdated systems. They were under-resourced, under-budgeted, and they did not have basic internal financial accounting controls to be able to send out the unemployment benefits to people that were actually unemployed. On a national basis, the scope of the fraud could rival, according to experts, $100 billion. Now, the Department of Labor admits that definitely 10% of it was stolen. And already out the door is $630 billion. That's a $63 billion fraud. And at OpenTheBooks.com, we believe that because we look back at the admitted Department of Labor improper and mistaken payments over the course of the past 5 years, and they average between 9% and 11% during that period. So definitely 10% is a very reasonable estimate. In this current bill, when they add another $230 billion worth of unemployment benefits, that's going to push the fraud number up to close to $90 billion. It could definitely exceed $100 billion.
Dave calling now from Irvine, California, independent caller. Good morning.
Good morning. How you doing? First of all, the national debt is never going to be solved until you start taxing taxes. It has to be this guy on the heat and all this. When the Republicans do things to raise the national debt, it's war, taking away health care, cutting this, cutting that, and the Democrats do things that raise just helping people. And there was only one president that ever was lowering the national debt, Bill Clinton. So he was lowering it, and it would be down now. But guys like this don't get that. You have to raise. Back in the 30s, when you had the crash, when it crashed, you've got to tax the rich. If a person was making let's say they were making $1 billion a year, anything over 5 million, they taxed them for any over that 90%, but they got away from that because all the Republicans says no, you got to pay for things. And what do the Republicans do? When people are on Social Security, they take away. They want to cut Social Security, but when the Republicans go to war and spend billions on war, and they don't pay for it, they say, "Oh my God, we got a debt problem." And do you start taxing the rich, these billionaires and trillionaires, and start taxing them? Let's just say 5 million. They get 5 million a year. They should be taxed 90%, not 30% or 25%. So,
Dave, thank you. We do get the points. Let's hear from our guest, Mr. Andrzejewski.
Well, we've got one party in Washington, D.C., and it's the party of let's all get rich together. Look, we've been very hard on congressional Republicans, and when President Trump was in office, on the president. Look, far too often, Republicans joined Democrats to drain the U.S. Treasury from the right. For example, when Republicans were in control of both houses of Congress and the presidency for the first 2 years of the Trump administration, we were running trillion-dollar deficits in this country during boom times. So, Republicans, they have not stood on fiscal conservative principles for a very long time.
Washington Post speaks to that, Mr. Andrzejewski. Jeff Stein has a piece, and part of it says that on the right, congressional Republicans may still fret about higher deficits, but the most popular politician among their voters does not. As a candidate and as president, Donald Trump blew past Republican concerns about the deficit, pushing for trillions in added spending and tax cuts while running unprecedented peacetime debt levels. And on the left, the article says, Democratic lawmakers have increasingly learned to ignore fears about spending too much. Party leaders have said they suffered crippling political defeats in the 2010s precisely because they did not deliver enough meaningful economic relief under Obama, a mistake that they see as an opportunity to correct under Biden. Democrats also repeatedly tout the 2017 Republican tax cut, which is expected to add about $2 trillion to the debt, as a reason to be skeptical of GOP concerns about fiscal restraint. Here's a quote from Barney Frank, Democrat from Massachusetts, former congressman. It's been a major shift. People have gone from being anti-government to beyond being even neutral on it to thinking, quote, we need the government. It has to help us. Any thoughts?
The thought that came into my head was Ronald Reagan's quote. When somebody knocks on your door and they say, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. It used to be that that was not a situation that you wanted. And far too often we're too willing to embrace that. Look, I think in this current bill, the American Rescue Act, the $1.9 trillion bill, where we're saying $1 trillion is not related to the pandemic and the virus. I want to give you another big example of this, and that's K through 12 education. During 2020, during the pandemic, Congress allocated $67 billion to K through 12 schools. Many of these schools aren't even open currently. In this new bill, overnight, $128 billion is allocated to K through 12 schools. But here's the thing. The White House spokesman admits, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, they did the study, that most of the money 95% of the money is going to be spent from 2022 through 2028. As a matter of fact, a whole third of that money is going to be spent after the 2024 election. So here's the point. Why allocate the money now? If you're going to need money in the future, make targeted legislation, convince taxpayers and constituents, and deliver the funding at that point. There is no need to obligate the American taxpayer right now for that largesse of funding.
Here is a tweet for you, Adam. Isn't all this money poured into the economy money that will be spent immediately, unlike the massive Trump-McConnell trillion-plus tax cut that poured into the stock market? When you say waste, you mean money that will be rapidly spent, correct?
Right. I think that begs the question, since these are government programs, what government program is running well? So we take a look at improper and mistaken payments. These are the 20 largest federal agencies that, going all the way back to 2004, admit when they improperly pay. It's a payment to the wrong person in the wrong amount or under the wrong set of federal rules. In 2019, we had $175 billion worth of improper and mistaken payments. In 2020, that number, we just got the latest numbers through the door, that has spiked to north of $220 billion, which is an incredible number. It's $17 billion a month. It's $500 million a day. It's $1 million a minute. The largest culprit are the two large federal programs, Medicaid and Medicare. $126 billion was admitted by Health and Human Services that was improperly, mistakenly paid out of those programs. The IRS administers the Earned Income Tax Credit. In this American Rescue Act, that program gets a boost. Well, the IRS admits that last year, 1 out of every $4, $16 billion paid out of that program was improperly and mistakenly paid. We reached out to the IRS for comment, and they said it's going to continue. They don't have the resources to stop it.
Let's get back to calls. Ursula, Little Rock, Arkansas, Democrat. Thank you for waiting.
Yes, thank you for letting me speak. Listen, I think President Biden is doing a great job. He's pouring all that money into the economy so the people can get back to work, get the vaccine in their arm, get back to work, and start paying taxes. So I think you're doing good. They need that money so the people can get back to work.
Thanks for calling. Let's hear from our guest.
Well, thank you very much for that comment. People do need gainful employment. The jobs report for February just came out on Friday, just a couple of days ago, and it was massive. 400,000 jobs were added to the economy in February. The January numbers were revised upward to about another 100,000 increase. So in the first 2 months of this year, this economy is coming back. About 500,000 jobs have been added to the economy. Do we really need such a massive stimulus at this point when you have the vaccinations? Look, the vaccinations, we're up to 90 million doses of the vaccinations that have been delivered. Hospital counts are down, new cases are down, deaths are down. We're coming back. The greatest story in America is the comeback story. We're going to do it again. And I don't think we need to do it with literally trillions of dollars of cash at this point.
Mr. Andrzejewski, one of the other threads of this conversation is about unspent money from previous bills. Here is a short clip from Senator John Kennedy, the Republican from Louisiana, talking about this point.
I'm disappointed that the president took the position that, look, we need to spend $2 trillion right now, even though there's $1 trillion at least in previously appropriated funds that we haven't spent yet. Now, a reasonable approach would have been to say, do we really need to spend $2 trillion? Maybe we ought to spend the other $1 trillion and see if that'll do it. Another reasonable approach would have been to say, maybe we ought to reprogram some of the $1 trillion that hasn't been spent. For example, we appropriated, I think, about $70 billion to our elementary and secondary schools. They've only spent $4 billion. So why are we giving them another $160 billion in President Biden's bill? Maybe, I'm not saying it's the case, but we ought to explore it. Maybe the schools didn't need the full $70 billion we gave them if they've only spent 4 or 5. So maybe we could reprogram some of that money.
Mr. Andrzejewski, this idea of reprogramming, can you give us a quick budget lesson? Explain what the senator is trying to say here. There's previous money that's not spent, but new money coming. How does that all come together?
Well, it's hard to spend these appropriated sums. Specific to education, we found $67 billion allocated to K through 12 schools. And all of that has been spent except for about $10 billion. I want to give you a specific example of how that money's been spent. About $100 million of that was spent in the city of Chicago, the Chicago public schools, on infrastructure, upgrading all facets of the school to virus-proof these buildings and make for a safe and comfortable learning environment. There's still, the high schools in Chicago still aren't open. After a year, finally, the union has agreed to come back into the classroom. We took a look at how much a Chicago public school teacher makes. And on pay and benefits, they average $108,000 per year. Now, put that in contrast to the parochial schools in Chicago. The Catholic schools, they haven't got $100 million of infrastructure to reopen. They've been back in the classroom since September. Teachers make half. You can be a PhD in the Catholic schools in the city of Chicago, and your pay tops out at $60,000.
Let's hear from Lewis. Lewis in Waycross, Georgia, Republican line. Good morning.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to know how much money the lawyers and the doctors got from PPP.
Something you can speak to, Mr. Andrzejewski?
Well, they got hundreds of millions of dollars. And look, I think there's a public purpose to some of those payments, certainly. Look, I think it might go down as the worst decision in the last 100 years to do something that was never tried from a public policy standpoint before, and that was a national lockdown. When you shut an economy down, when you throw 40 million people out of work, there's a public policy argument that it's akin to eminent domain. When government takes your property, they owe you for it. When they shut you down, they owe payments for that. And so specific to healthcare, I think there was multiple programs, not only for medicine, but also for dentists, to keep the healthcare infrastructure of the country strong while the country focused on this pandemic.
Here is a tweet for you. There is procurement fraud in the military. Does your website cover that?
Well, we want to do an oversight report on the United States military, both on the bureaucracy, contracts, spending. We've covered this a little bit, especially here on C-SPAN's Washington Journal over the years. So we did a report on use it or lose it contract spending in the last month of the fiscal year, where the federal agencies spend down their budgets this year so they get the same or more money from Congress next year. Specifically, we hired millions of dollars spent on lobster tail and snow crab at the Pentagon. This led even last year to hearings in the House with generals addressing the Armed Services Committee, asking them to tie the appropriation to the United States military to rules on eliminating that wasteful use it or lose it end of year spending. And we're proud of that work.
Brenda, Jonesville, Virginia, thank you for waiting. Democratic caller, hey there.
Thank you, honey, for taking my call.
You're welcome.
I was wanting to ask Adam, what did he think about the Republicans not voting with the Democrats to try to help people, and then plus two, all of these people that's trying to feed their families and can't feed their families, they're getting in lines to get food to feed their families, but everybody that's in Congress is not going without a check. They're getting their check regardless.
Thank you for your comment, your question. I'll do my best to answer it. I think from the Republican standpoint, they take a look at where we're at right now, and it looks like the comeback story is unfolding. Furthermore, at OpenTheBooks.com, our auditors took a look at household income in 2020. And because of all the aid, the $4.1 trillion that Congress threw at the economy, at the virus, individuals, at every segment of society, household incomes actually rose in 2020. So I think that gets back to the point with $1 trillion unspent off the $4 trillion. Let the dollars work through the economy. If there is areas, for instance, testing, vaccinations, restaurants have taken a particular hit. Airlines or other industries, small businesses, individuals come in with a targeted relief bill.
Tell us more about OpenTheBooks.com. What is the size of the operation? What kind of budget do you work with?
So we play a lot larger than what we are. So we're up against the national think tanks. Some of these think tanks have 20, 30, 40, $100 million a year budgets. We're proud last year we grew our budget to 2.8 million. And we've got about 30 full-time equivalents. Most of those people are on the data capture side. We've got about 23 full-time employees that last year filed and followed up with and broke open and mapped to our website the production from those 40,000 Freedom of Information Act requests, and they captured $6 trillion. The remaining folks that work for OpenTheBooks.com are auditors. And what we do is we not only open the books, we audit those books, and our audits make national news like what we're talking about here today.
How long have you been around?
So we launched on a national basis back in 2013. We did something that was historic and unique. We took the entire federal checkbook, we pushed it to your cell phone with a mobile app for Apple and Android, which localized all federal spending into your zip code. And I wrote the editorial at the Wall Street Journal, Track Government Spending on Your Phone. That was 2013. We launched actually on a stateside basis in Illinois. It is the Super Bowl of corruption. It is where we're based. And we started in Illinois posting all pay and pensions and checkbook as early as 2011. And then we took the model writ large on a national basis.
Back to calls in just a moment for Adam Andrzejewski. Wanted to point out this piece that you wrote in Forbes. Sir, Dr. Anthony Fauci, the highest paid employee in the entire federal government. Tell us more. Why did you write this piece? How much does he make? And how do you feel about it?
So we got the new federal payroll through the door. And we noticed that the most highly compensated federal employee, even out-earning President Donald Trump, was Dr. Anthony Fauci. So Anthony Fauci's been at Health and Human Services since 1968, so about 52 years. We're holding the last 10 years worth of federal payroll. So we took a look at that. And just in the past 4 years, Fauci's salary increased from $335,000 up to $417,000 in 2019. In 2020, a spokesman at HHS has confirmed that he got another pay increase up to $434,000. So out of 4 million federal employees, that's in your United States military, that's at the post office, the 2.1 million employees at the federal executive agencies, the number one most highly compensated is Dr. Anthony Fauci.
So he is 80 years old. Wouldn't he make that kind of money just from being around that long?
You would think so. Somebody made the argument he's the most undercompensated federal employee, because if he retired, his pension would be north of $300,000. So the delta is only a little over $100,000.
Let's hear from Sue. Sue is in Kentucky, independent caller. Good morning, Sue.
Good morning.
What would you like to say?
I love Mr. Adams. I love him opening the book. Yes, I'd like to know how the government is spending our money. Nancy, Cumberland, all of them. Open the book on them where our tax money is going. They've got their big homes, their new cars, you name it. They're out nothing. We are the ones that's out, and we're the ones struggling. And quite frankly, I've been a Democrat. I've been a Republican. I'm independent. I don't know what I'll go from there. But we are sick of it. American people are sick of it. We can't own our homes if we don't pay our taxes. We can't own our cars. We own nothing. We have to pay them. Our taxes are being ate up by every one of the politicians. We're fed up with it. They need to cut them people down. They need a cap on their pay. They don't need to be took care of for life in there.
All right, voice of Sue there from Kentucky. Anything you want to say there?
Yeah, I think quite evidently the system's been gamed by the elites in this country. And I want to take you to a couple examples from our oversight work at OpenTheBooks.com. It's the Ivy League colleges. It's the 25 colleges with the largest endowments. These 25 schools, they collectively have an endowment north of $320 billion. That's a third of $1 trillion in their endowments. They don't need taxpayer help. On the CARES Act, which was the coronavirus aid bill from a year ago, $13 billion was allocated to universities and colleges. And we took a look at those 25 wealthy schools. And in the CARES Act, they were allocated $1 billion of our tax money. They can't make the argument that they needed the money, but they sure want the money.
Anthony from West Bloomfield, Michigan now, Democratic caller. Hey, Anthony.
Good morning, Mark. You've criticized both parties on this, and my question is, why don't they do the hard work? I mean, we send them to Congress to do this. How did the bills, get so inflated to this point? I think that adds to some of the, the separation we have in this country. We expect our elected representatives to do what's best for us, but can you explain a little bit about the process? And then, recently they've been talking about adding earmarks back to the policy. But this sounds like that's already in there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, earmarks are the gateway drug of corruption. Our former honorary chairman, Dr. Tom Coburn, who, like I said, passed a year ago, he was instrumental in delivering the earmark ban on, when Congress banned earmarks through a rule change. And that rule change has now been reversed by House Democrats. Look, both parties are responsible for this. I want to tell you a story of how hard it was for our auditors to simply get detail on the $350 billion in this bill flowing to states and local units of government. We tried for a week to get the specifics, the line-by-line accounting on the 30,000 counties and municipalities that would receive $120 billion out of this bill. And it took us a week, and we were asking Republicans and Democrats, and finally a staffer turned over the database, and within 12 hours, we had oversight up at Forbes on where the money was going. I detailed out some of these wealthy communities getting the money, but you also have large cities that are mismanaged. So, for instance, the city of New York in this American Rescue Act is going to get more than $4 billion out of this bill. We compared that amount versus the state governments, and New York City will get more money than 25 state governments out of this bill. We took a look at Chicago. Chicago's just right up the road from us at OpenTheBooks.com. We're in the suburbs. Chicago, the bonds are junk status. Chicago's going to get $2 billion out of this bill, and that outranks 12 states.
Our guest has been Adam Andrzejewski, founder and CEO of OpenTheBooks.com. One more look at the website there, OpenTheBooks.com. Thanks a lot for your time this morning. Appreciate you coming on with us.
Paul, thank you. Thank you very much.
And we say thanks to all of our viewers, all of you out there who called over this past 3-hour stretch. And we'll see you back here tomorrow, 7 o'clock Eastern, for another edition of this program, Washington Journal. Enjoy the rest of your day.